Pendleton begins by quoting a contemporary of his, Congregational scholar Dr. Edward Griffin of Williams College. Griffin, writing on communion, says this, quote, "First, baptism is the initiatory ordinance which introduces us into the visible church. Of course, where there is no baptism, there are no visible churches. Second, that we ought not to commune with those who are not baptized and, of course, are not church members, even if we regard them as Christians. Should a pious Quaker so far depart from his principles as to wish to commune with me at the Lord's table while I refuse to be baptized, I could not receive him, because there is such a relationship established between the ordinances. I have no right to separate them. In other words, I have no right to send the sacred elements out of the church. The only question then is whether those associations of evangelical Christians that call themselves churches and that practice sprinkling are real churches of Christ. In other words, whether baptism by sprinkling is valid baptism. I want you to note, this Protestant emphatically states that he does not regard Quakers as church members and thus not a church. Why? Because they do not practice baptism. Griffin continues, quote, "If nothing but immersion is baptism, there is no visible church except among the Baptists. What is a church? It is a company of believers in covenant with God, essentially organized according to the gospel, holding the essential doctrines and practicing the essential duties. If you demand more, you may not find a church on earth." End quote. Now Pendleton writes, quote, "It is seen from the foregoing that Dr. Griffin fully admits that where there is no baptism, there are no visible churches. This is the belief of Baptists. Indeed, the declaration may be considered a scriptural axiom. We can reason from it. Griffin says, the only question then is whether those associations of evangelical Christians that call themselves churches and that practice sprinkling are real churches of Christ. This is the question, plain to those who wish to understand it. But Dr. Griffin gives it a simplifying touch and makes it too plain to be misunderstood. He brings the whole matter into this narrow compass, quote, whether baptism by sprinkling is valid baptism. No one who deserves the name of Baptist will hesitate to answer an emphatic no. I use Dr. Griffin's expression, fully aware of the solecism couched in the phrase, quote, baptism by sprinkling. It is as philologically objectionable as the phrase immersion by sprinkling. Now, for those who may not have caught what Pendleton has done here, let me explain. He points out that the statement, baptism by sprinkling, is a grammatical mistake. It's a solecism. It is akin to saying immersion by sprinkling. This is nonsensical. It would be like saying, I went to Florida for a vacation. I flew by driving. Now I ask, is immersion by sprinkling even possible? No, this is illogical. It is the universal belief of Baptists that the action of sprinkling or pouring, so far from being baptism, does not bear the remotest resemblance to it. They cannot imagine how any analogy can be detected even with the aid of a theological microscope. Dr. Griffin concedes that if sprinkling is not baptism, then Pedobaptist organizations are not visible churches of Christ. For, says he, quote, where there is no baptism, there are no visible churches. From this premise, laid down with admirable clearness and candor, every Baptist is irresistibly and inevitably led to the conclusion that there are no visible churches of Christ among Pedobaptists. To show that I do not misrepresent Dr. Griffin's view, I will quote him again. He says, quote, if nothing but immersion is baptism, there is no visible church except among the Baptists, end quote. Now, nothing but immersion is baptism, say virtually all Baptists. Baptists, therefore, Dr. Griffin being judge, look alone among themselves for visible churches of Christ.